The idea of race and how people view other people based on their physical characteristics, characteristics like skin color, hair texture, and eye shape, has a very long history. Race itself is based on how a society decides to categorize people based on their physical characteristics. It's not a biological reality per se, it is a social construct. I have made a video about this before, you can check it out here, but race as we know it has changed over time. White people didn't always exist. If you went to the United Kingdom 500 years ago and brought a Sicilian there and you told the Englishman, this person, this Sicilian is the same quote unquote race as you, they would look at you crazy. If you brought a Polish person to Scotland and told a Scottish person that this Polish person is the same race as you, they would have no idea what you're talking about. When Europeans landed in North America, when they set up the first colonies in the USA, they didn't call themselves white. They didn't call themselves and the new settlers white people. Whiteness was invented and was maintained. And because of that, the idea of white is still around today. But how did this happen? When did people become white? Whiteness hasn't always existed. Europe is a very ethnically, linguistically, and genetically diverse place. The genetic ancestry of Europeans can be broken down into a few major groups that mixed over thousands of years, creating modern Europeans with different rates of these ancestries depending on the region. These ancestral components, the Western hunter gatherers, Anatolian Neolithic farmers, and Western steppe herders, make up the majority of most European people's DNA. Of course, for all these groups, you can actually break down their ancestry further. But these components are also seen in high rates outside of Europe. Middle Easterners and North Africans have high Anatolian Neolithic farmer DNA. Western steppe herder DNA is seen in high rates in parts of Asia, like with certain ethnic groups like the Pashtun people or the Roars of India. These prehistoric ancestors of Europeans didn't make them quote unquote white. Europeans, up until not that long ago, did not consider themselves white. Even once they started to refer to themselves as white, for hundreds of years, many groups that we now think of as white were not seen as white. Modern whiteness originates with colonialism, with the transatlantic slave trade playing a big part in the development of the white identity. Black slaves weren't the only source of labor on slave plantations in the New World. At one point during the early years of colonialism in the 1600s, European indentured servants were very common, and at one point they were the majority of workers in places like the Caribbean. And although their conditions were quite horrible, they did not have to go through the same things as these African slaves. The indentured servants, because they were Christians, made it so that by law they were exempt from lifetime captivity. African slaves, however, were allowed to be enslaved, and so the mass transportation of Africans to the New World began. These cruel conditions of the plantations of places like the Caribbean created a problem, however: unity and revolt. If these African slaves came together with these European indentured servants and realized that no matter their label, no matter their religion, they were being exploited and disrespected either way, then they will revolt against the master, against the owners of these plantations. The Bacon's Rebellion of 1676 was a prime example of this fear. Indentured servants and African slaves coming together and fighting for something they believed in. Originally, to combat this, the plantation owners tried to give the European servants legal status as Christians, which enjoyed certain privileges that the Africans didn't have. But by the end of the 17th century, they started to refer to the more privileged class of European indentured servants as whites rather than Christians. Whiteness then became a part of laws. Virginia's 1691 law forbidding marriage between whites and Negro, mulatto, and Indian people, one of the earliest codified uses of a quote unquote white in law. The 1705 Virginia Slave Codes, which explicitly tied slavery to African descent and gave legal privileges to those defined as quote unquote white. Naturalization laws like the U.S. Naturalization Act of 1790, which restricted citizenship to quote unquote free white persons, showing how whiteness was literally written into the foundation of the state. This was the basis of race in the West as we know it now. Giving European servants the label white gave them some proximity to the slave owners, to the people with power. These extra privileges made it so that they saw themselves as different, as a part of the civilized people. Now, black slaves, on the other hand, were seen as different from both, even if now they were Christians as well. White was superior. A hierarchy based on the color of your skin was formed. This decreased the likelihood of revolts that united indentured servants and slaves. Divide and conquer. Once these labels of race were created, all it needed now was a belief that these characteristics that people put on these labels were true. The European powers colonized the New World, creating settlements and killed indigenous people, whether it be through violence or disease, resulting in the death of up to 90% of the indigenous people of the Americas. They then called them savages when they tried to defend their land, then imported millions of slaves from Africa, kept them captives for generations for hundreds of years. These non whites were historically both exploited and kept away from opportunity to grow and prosper. But because of that, the whites who were in positions of power created a hierarchy based on color, based on race. The American racial hierarchy at the time was like the ones in Latin America, or the casta system. White people at the very top, which at the time meant more specifically people mostly from Great Britain, minus the Irish, but also included Western or Central Europeans like Germans, French, etc. Then under them would be mixed race individuals, especially if they were white passing, and then indigenous people, and at the bottom was black Africans. Within this, of course, was also a class hierarchy. A lower class WASP, or a white Anglo Saxon Protestant, was lower than a higher class one, of course, but still higher than an indigenous person. So even if a lower class white can relate to an indigenous person or a black person in terms of living conditions and how they feel oppressed within that society because they are told that they are white and better than the others, they won't feel a need to unite against the common enemy. This racial hierarchy is very similar to the caste system, like I mentioned, in Latin America, where white Spaniards were at the top, mixed individuals in the middle, indigenous people below them, and then African slaves at the bottom. It's obvious that this hierarchy is directly related to the oppression faced by these groups. Black slaves were the most oppressed. They were enslaved for life with no privileges. Then their children were also enslaved, and so on for hundreds of years. Indigenous people were pushed off their land, and many went through slavery as well, depending on where they were. Those that didn't mix with the whites were therefore left out, and the opportunities that the people in power had, they kept to themselves and pushed indigenous people closer to the outskirts. Power and privilege was directly correlated with being white. It was placed in law as well. White was seen as a superior race. White people genuinely believed that they were better than others. This was a common belief, and they used this to justify slavery. We are better than the blacks, so we enslave them. They aren't even humans. We are better than the natives, so we take their land. Fast forward a few hundred years, we see that colonialism has become global with colonies all over the world. The European powers spread their ideas of whiteness, putting whiteness at the top of the hierarchies in places like apartheid South Africa. Proximity to whiteness also benefited people. They made casteism much worse in the Indian subcontinent. Caste and color was linked, and lighter skin was put on a pedestal, something that still exists today in the Indian subcontinent. Matter of fact, it exists in most former colonies. Eurocentric features, whiteness was seen at the top of the top, as they were the rulers. They forced these beliefs onto people. Anyways, in the West, in places like the USA, even post slavery, certain laws made it so that by law, white people enjoyed more privileges. Jim Crow laws in the South maintained segregation, which, by the way, 90% of black people in the USA lived in the South by the year 1900. And although this did decrease over time after the waves of the Great Migration, majority of African Americans lived in the segregated South during Jim Crow. But what we do start to see is that as newer European immigrants started migrating to the USA, more specifically Italian and Irish, they weren't considered white. Whiteness being a social construct, they had their own beliefs on which backgrounds were white in America. They only started being seen as white as their populations grew. They became more prominent in places like media or sports, but most of it had to do with climbing the economic ladder. As they were seen as more successful, the white identity became more accepting of them. After all, they already had very light skin and were Christians. Irish were the first of these groups to be considered white. Italians and Eastern Europeans became white a few generations later, and by the 1930s, they were considered white. But being on the same level as WASPs took much more time. After a while, they just kind of accepted everyone that is of majority European ancestry or at least white passing as white. Today, in our modern world, there are many different definitions of what white is. What white is in Canada, USA, or the UK is different to what it is in Brazil. We do see a trend even today that with more European DNA, it correlates with higher socioeconomic status. And this is prevalent in places like the USA and to an extent Latin America, places like Brazil, even though Brazil is a very mixed country. Race is a social construct just like ethnicity is. Black is just as socially constructed as white is, but I do believe it is important to know the origins of these categories. We have more in common than we don't. Our hate for one another originates in the people that had the wealth, the people that wanted to exploit the regular people, wanting to create a label to stop rebellion. Remember that the next time you see how identity politics plays out in your country or your city, the same story gets repeated. And as long as we play along, we will stay separated.